Hello and welcome to part 2 of our unit on Native Americans in Virginia. In part 1, we talked about how we know about North America's first people all these years later. We now know that it is due to the work of archaeologists who carefully uncover artifacts that help us to infer what life was like for Native Americans. In part 2, we are going to dive into who these people were. Our learning targets for today involve some more map skills. You should be able to show an understanding of the Native Americans in Virginia by locating the 3 major language groups on a map and correctly identify which tribe spoke each language. Native Americans have been called many things over time. Indians, American Indians, Native Americans, First People, and the list goes on. They are America's indigenous people, which means the first to inhabit an area. They are the only people who are truly native to this country. Anyone who is not Native American has ancestors who immigrated from other countries at some point, whether that happened in recent years or as far back as the first colonists. When Christopher Columbus made his trek from Spain, there was much undiscovered land. This doesn't mean that no one lived in those lands. It just means that people from large, wealthy countries had never been there, and it was not on any maps. Columbus was working for Spain to find a northwest passage from Europe to Asia by ship. When he landed in North America, thinking he'd arrived in the Indies, he wrote that he had found Indians. We know this to be false today, but with the technology and knowledge of the time, it was impossible to know that he'd landed on a continent not yet on maps. Over 100 years later, when the English arrived at Jamestown, there were hundreds of tribes living throughout what is now the state of Virginia. For this unit, we are going to focus our attention on 3 major tribes and language groups. First, in Southwest Virginia and parts of the Piedmont and Tidewater regions were the Cherokee, who spoke Iroquoian. On this map, they are shown in the purple areas. Moving east, the Monacan tribe lived largely in the Piedmont region and spoke Siouan. Lastly, the Powhatan tribes, which were a large group of separate tribes under one leader, spoke Algonquian and lived in the Tidewater region. You can remember the tribes in order with the phrase Indians shoot arrows, and the languages with the phrase cheesy mashed potatoes. These tribes, while similar in some ways, were also very different in others due to their different environments. Over time, every tribe adapted to the land in which they lived. Many Cherokee people lived in heavily wooded areas, so they made use of the lumber by building tall log stockades to keep the village safe. You can see one depicted in the illustration here. And though they built their walls, trade was vital to their survival. Women were often in charge of this and other things like planting and harvesting, choosing the tribal chief, and sitting on war councils. In this tribe, women were considered equal to men, which was very progressive considering women were not equals in European society or even American society for hundreds of years after settlement. Unfortunately, it was the Cherokee people who were forced to walk hundreds of miles to Oklahoma in the 1800s by the Americans who wanted their land. Many died, and it became known as the Trail of Tears. The Monacans, who spoke Siouan, stretched along the James and Rappahannock rivers. Their name means earth digger, which was very appropriate. These tribes had a special way of burying their dead. Instead of underground, they covered them in dirt mounds that housed hundreds of people. The picture here shows what it looked like, although all of these mounds in the Piedmont region have been destroyed over the years. Monacans also had access to lots of copper, which was a sign of great wealth. Lastly, we have the Algonquian-speaking Powhatan tribes. By the late 1500s, between 14 and 20,000 people lived in the Tidewater region. It's no surprise that this was a great meeting place for many neighboring tribes and a great location to set up homes. It is near the water, so fishing was vital to life in the area, in addition to hunting. In order to travel, Powhatan people built dugout canoes by burning a hole into a log and scraping the inside out. Many homes also had vegetable gardens like you might see today, and some towns had large community gardens for large-scale growing. Finally, the Powhatan were unique in appearance because their warriors had intricate tattoos and they shaved the right side of their heads to prevent their bow hand from getting tangled in their hair. And that's a wrap. Now that you've watched this lesson, you should be able to locate Virginia's Native American tribes and language groups on a map. This will take some continued practice, but you can always come back for review. In our next lesson, we'll talk about how all of Virginia's Native people adapted to their environment to gain food, shelter, and clothing. See you next time.